From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Let's get a check on the markets, as we do pretty much every day. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So S&P headed for its best month since April, I think, but it's taking a little money off the table today, Abigail.
It certainly is on the last day of the best month since April. So the bull's taking a little bit of a breather here on this Monday, despite the positive vaccine news out of Moderna, diminishing returns around that. You almost have to question, David, whether or not this is a sell the news moment around the vaccine. And if yes, is it just today and for a couple of days, a small pause, or is it something bigger? We will only know with time. It's worth noting that some of the havens over the last year or so are sharply higher, telling us that some investors are hedging. But for the month of November, it's really remarkable. The S&P 500 up more than 10%. The Russell 2000 up nearly 20%. Its best month ever. Standing out the most to me, David, the financials up nearly 20% this month. The best month going all the way back to April of 2009. That, of course, was around the whole green shoots rhetoric. What makes it so interesting, David, going into this month of November, the financials had already been up 30% out of the March low, plus the yield curve has actually come in. So it's sort of puzzling why the banks are up so much. You have to think it has to do with a narrative around traders and investors buying stocks, so cyclical stocks for the second half of next year on the potential for a strong recovery.
So, Abigail, I'm going to cheat here a little bit. You and I talk even when we're not on television, and we had this conversation about the yen and what's going on with safe haven. What's going on with the yen?
Well, those are some of my favorite conversations off air, David, because we can really just move back and forth. And the yen does really bring some attention to itself. Over the last year, the yen is actually up about 4%. So when you have stocks at all-time highs, you have bonds at record highs, although folks will say, or near record highs, I should say, folks will say that that's the Fed. The yen is a pure play haven. So over the last year, it's up about 4%. This tells you that some traders, they like the fact, or they might like the fact that stocks are higher, but they're probably hedging for the possibility that there could be some choppiness ahead. That's true, too, for the VIX. While we have stocks near all-time highs, the VIX is still above 20. That's in its historically, let's say, elevated range. Traders are on alert for the possibility of some sort of volatility ahead. The question is, will it be a normal cooling off of after a up 10% month, or could it be something bigger, David?
Well, we'll find out. Thank you so much, Abigail. Great to have you with us. Abigail Doolittle reporting on the markets. Congress, in the meantime, is back in session with a full agenda, including funding the government and that stimulus bill that everyone seems to agree is needed, but nobody can quite get done. To take us through what to expect in this lame duck session, we welcome now back Greg Valliere. He is AGF Investments Chief U.S. Policy Strategist. So, Greg, great to have you with us. Let's start with that stimulus, because as I say, everyone seems to agree we need it, but we can never quite get there.
Well, you're right, David. I think there's a consensus that we really do need it. You saw over the Thanksgiving weekend photos of people standing in line for food. You see unemployment benefits ending on December 31st. There's a really crucial need to get something done.
At the same time, there's a question about, do we take half a loaf or we insist on all of it? This was what the back and forth was through the summer, really, between Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and Mitch McConnell over on the Republican side. Do we know where President-elect Biden is on that question?
I think he would take half a loaf, yes. I think there's a great deal of dissension over Nancy Pelosi's unwillingness to compromise. I think now something paltry like just a mere $1 trillion would be sufficient. Her idea of getting $3 trillion is totally out of the question. But if you did $1 trillion or $800 billion, you could feed people during the winter. You could give them unemployment benefits until the vaccines arrive.
At the same time, are the Republicans going to insist on that protection against liability because of COVID?
That's a big issue for Mitch McConnell. He's going to want that, and the Democrats are going to want a big chunk of money for state and local governments. That's been a big dispute. I do think, though, that with people like Susan Collins of Maine being even more powerful after her victory, we could still put a deal together in the next couple of weeks.
So a couple of weeks. There's no deadline on a stimulus bill. Everyone agrees we need it, but there's no deadline. There is a deadline on funding the government. Could those two things come together conceivably? The deadline, as I understand, is December 11?
You're right. At midnight on December 11th, the temporary spending bill expires. Theoretically, we could wake up on December 12th with the government shut down. I don't think that's going to happen. Nobody wants it. But more and more people are saying, since we have to pass this, let's put some stimulus, some virus stimulus onto the budget bill. I think that has a chance.
In the meantime, to what extent is the White House playing in all of this? Because President Trump has not conceded, although every time he comes out and talks to camera, it sounds like he's sort of inching his way there. But he's also said they're going to keep working right up to January 20. There are a lot of things he can still do, can't he?
A lot of things he could do. He certainly is playing a lot of golf. I think that he would need to get more involved. It'll be interesting to see tomorrow when Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, testifies before Congress. I think he might get the green light from the White House to keep negotiating. That would be a very, very positive sign.
And what about in the area of foreign affairs? Because that's something the president can really do things in without any congressional support at all.
The biggest wild card of all, David, is geopolitics. We saw over the weekend the assassination in Iran. I think that Netanyahu knows that he has carte blanche, that Trump wouldn't try to stop him in the next 7 weeks. I worry about the Persian Gulf. I worry about China. I think geopolitics is a risk in these next 7 weeks.
Well, you mentioned Iran and that assassination of the nuclear scientist over apparently by the Israelis. I thought it was interesting that Iran came out right away and condemned it, said we're going to retaliate, but said this shouldn't get in the way of possible talks with the Biden administration. Is that sort of an end run around President Trump?
Could be. And that's what everyone is speculating on right now. Do Netanyahu and Trump want to make things more difficult for Biden? Or could Biden actually play his cards adroitly and get something with the Iranians? That's going to be an ongoing story during the spring.
Greg, in the meantime, back here, we now have basically the leadership of the economic team for President-elect Biden. It was announced just today, led by Treasury Secretary-designate Janet Yellen. How difficult will it be to get confirmation through the Senate of these people?
She'll be a breeze. There's a woman who might have some trouble who's been nominated for OMB, but I think that Janet Yellen has widespread support in the markets, on Main Street, on Capitol Hill, and academia. I think she'll sail through.
What kind of timing do we have on this? Because we have seen administrations before that had a difficult time getting all their people in place to get up and running by anything close to January, even February.
Yeah, I'm sure some of this will go past Christmas, go into the new year. But on most of the big nominations, especially Yellen, I do think a moderate Republican like Susan Collins is going to be very, very powerful.
Well, it's interesting about that because she did surprise a lot of people, I think it's fair to say, in her victory. Well, how could she use that power, the Senator Collins?
Well, Senator Collins is personally friendly with Biden. The Republicans respect her greatly. She has good support back home. She's got a new 6-year term. So I think on issue after issue, David, I would watch Susan Collins as an indicator as to what we might be able to get.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. It's always a treat to have you with us, Greg. It's Greg Valliere of AGF Investments. Coming up, Austan Goolsby of the University of Chicago on the Biden economic team and what it takes to put together a stimulus plan that works. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says there is still no deal to resolve a standoff with Poland and Hungary over their vow to veto the European Union's landmark $2.2 trillion spending package. But she says she vows to work for an agreement. Both nations' leaders are discussing next steps after delaying the EU's 7-year budget, including some $300 million in pandemic aid. Moderna is requesting clearance for its COVID-19 vaccine as new analysis finds the vaccine is 94% effective in preventing the virus with no serious side effects and showed 100% efficacy against serious cases of the disease in young and old alike. Moderna says the Food and Drug Administration is likely to review the data in mid-December. President Trump's coronavirus task force is promising a rapid rollout of vaccines to millions of Americans by the end of the year. Surgeon General Jerome Adams expects most Americans to have access to a vaccine by early in the second quarter. He says the government hopes to quickly okay requests from 2 drug makers for emergency approval of their vaccines. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy is tightening the limit on outdoor gatherings to 25 people. That's down from 150, and it'll halt indoor high school sports for the rest of 2020. The move reportedly comes after more than 28,000 new COVID-19 cases were booked in the state in the past week. Meanwhile, the positivity rate in New York City has climbed above 4%. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. 12 years ago, President Obama came to office with a struggling economy and fought to get a stimulus package despite the political hurdles. Austan Goolsby was a key Obama economic advisor and saw from the inside what it took to get that done. He's now professor of economics at Chicago's Booth School, and we welcome now back to Bloomberg. So welcome. It's great to have you, Professor. Thanks for being here.
Yeah,
so
thanks for having me, David.
There are some parallels in what we're seeing right now with a struggling economy, the need for stimulus everybody seems to agree on, some political difficulty in getting it done. What advice would you give to the incoming administration about how to do that and how to do it effectively?
Well, I do think there are some parallels. If only Mitch McConnell was a thorn in the side of both of those. And I think the thought in 2009, if you remember, was let's do some, and if things remain bad, we'll just do more. But Mitch McConnell saw to it that there would not be more. So I think if you look at the incoming Biden administration, they're probably going to put some significant focus on try to get as much direct relief as you can, as early as you can, because the economy needs it. Now, one difference is in 2009, that was traditional stimulus. The U.S. government's going to spend money, try to get growth jump-started. This is different. I mean, this is a temporary wave that's spread over us, and we basically need to figure out a way to hold our breath for 6 or 8 months until the vaccine can be widely available and we can go back to doing what we were doing before. So our goal is to try to prevent permanent damage, which is a little different from stimulus. But I hope that they can agree to do something. I mean, we need the money right now.
Well, and that goes to the question that's been pending, frankly, since July 31, when the supplementary unemployment benefits went away. The question is, do you hold out for the full loaf or take half a loaf? Thus far, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she's come down off of her $3.3 trillion, but still, she's insisted on a lot. Would you advise the incoming president to say, take what you can get during this lame duck session?
I guess I disagree a little bit with the premise of that question. We need as much as we can get as soon as we can get it. My perception of what's happening is not that the Democrats are holding out. It's that, once again, like in 2009, Mitch McConnell has decided that a deal is not favorable to him before these Georgia runoff elections. And so it's not primarily a dispute about the size of the rescue. It's about one side not wanting there to be a bill at all. So I think if Mnuchin and Pelosi were the only 2 deciders, they would have been able to reach an agreement. I mean, they were close on numbers and how long it would last. I just think the politics of this whole thing is quite complicated in the lame duck.
Well, that's sobering because, as you suggest, if it's a question of not giving the other side credit for something before those runoff elections, that suggests we're not going to have anything until into the new year.
Yeah, and I'm quite afraid of that because, as you say, look, the unemployment money ran out. The CARES Act money through the PPP program that was going to help give a lifeline to small business, that money's run out. And the Treasury, you saw last week, said they're going to withdraw the money for the Fed Main Street lending facility. So that money's not going to be there. So I think this issue that we are inches away from having permanent damage that we did not have to have, that I think everybody should find sobering.
So, Austin, talk about that permanent damage, as you put it, because there's a great deal of hope that a vaccine is coming. It's not here yet. It'll probably be at least into the middle of next year before it really is widely disseminated. And so we need a bridge to get there. What kind of damage can happen in the meantime? Because some people might say, well, let's just wait. We'll get the vaccine. We'll be okay in the long run.
Yeah, but we need the bridge, like you said. And the alternative is falling down in the water. And there are literally millions of businesses around the country that I would say they're going to go bankrupt. But as you know, something like 90% of business closures they can't afford to go through bankruptcy. They just shut the doors and they're never heard from again. And that's a space that we absolutely don't want to have to go down. But right now we're on path to. Two, in all the states and pretty much all the major cities of the country, they're having revenue shortages like they've never seen, with expenses that are up dramatically because of the pandemic. And they're going to have to start laying off policemen, firefighters, teachers, and a whole bunch of state services that we kind of need at a moment like this. So I think those are the two big speed bumps that I fear. And then the third is, underlying this whole thing, the virus is the boss. And if you cannot get control of the spread of this virus until the middle of next year when the vaccine comes, there will be thousands of people who die unnecessarily. There will be tens of thousands of people who are hospitalized or suffer permanent health damage permanently, unnecessarily. So I really hope that Congress does as big a package of relief as they can as rapidly as possible, so we don't get people evicted from their homes. I mean, millions of people are going to get evicted.
So Austin, talk about the perhaps medium term. We now have at least the key players in President-elect Biden's economic team, led, of course, by Janet Yellen as Secretary of Treasury, but a fair number of other people, many of whom you've worked with, including in the White House. People are trying to read into it exactly how progressive his economic policies are going to be. What do you read into it?
I found the team really impressive. I mean, Janet Yellen is a rock star, of course, and well known. But down the line, if you look at the people they're appointing, they have experience. They're low drama people. I think the thematic focus, if you had to say, is there a thematic focus? Certainly at the Council of Economic Advisors, you got a heavy focus on workers with experience on wages, on training, on contingent workers, and it shows an emphasis on wages and workers. As to what does it mean for the agenda? Of course, all of that hinges on what happens in the election, and are Democrats going to control the Senate or not control the Senate, because that will have a heavy influence on what they can actually do in legislation.
Austin, you make a very important point, I think, that the names I've seen so far, there is an emphasis on labor economists, some very distinguished labor economists, no question about it. At the same time, do they have enough macroeconomists? Is that a possible weakness of this team? Because you could have problems come up, if you've seen, that are outside the world of labor, and you need a really crackerjack macroeconomist in there.
Yeah, I mean, you always have to cover more topics than you have people. I would imagine as they fill out the team, you'll have more focus on tax and budget. You'll have more focus on macro. Several of the people that they're talking about, Jared Bernstein, Heather Boucher, do have some macro exposure as well as the labor economics exposure. I think the Janet Yellen at Treasury, in a way, serving as your Babe Ruth, it gives you some. There's nobody knows more about macro, nobody knows more about international, about banking than the former chair of the Fed, who's now the Secretary of the Treasury. So I do think they kind of got themselves some breathing room for whatever other focus they want to have.
Nobody's going to question Janet Yellen's competence as a first-rate economist. At the same time, there's another part to that job, which has to do with foreign diplomacy and sanctions and things like that. How's she going to cover that base? Because that's not something she spent a lot of time on.
Yes and no. The number two at Treasury is somebody who's got a heavy international focus. And she's known, unlike most, she's got to be the most internationally recognized Secretary of the Treasury in a very long time. I mean, from her connections to having been the Fed chair, I would think that the international issues are not going to be foreign to her. They're going to be somewhat familiar. And to the extent that in the last 2 weeks you've seen a blow up in the relationship between the Fed and the Treasury at a moment when you kind of don't want blow ups in the relationship between the Fed and the Treasury. That would give you some comfort. Hey, it's good to know that the Secretary of the Treasury knows very well the issues of the Fed and is going to get along very well with.
She knows Jay Powell pretty well, I think it's fair to say. Thank you so much, Austan. Always a treat to talk with you. That's Austan Goolsby. He's professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Still ahead, shares of Nikola plunge after GM scales back on a partnership. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for Stock of the Hour, and today it's Nikola, the fuel cell vehicle company that today entered into a scaled-back version of its deal with General Motors. And our colleague, Emma Chandra, is here with the entire story. Emma, great to talk to you.
Great to speak to you, David. And it's a scaled-back deal that really scraps the key components. What we've learned today is that GM will not be making an all-electric pickup truck with Nikola, and that GM will not be taking an equity stake in Nikola. That had been rumored to be worth about $2 billion. Instead, what we have is a non-binding agreement to supply hydrogen fuel tech. Now, investors taking a dim view of that. Look at that. Nikola down around 20% today. It was down 27 to 28% at the lows. Now, the original terms of the proposed deal with GM had been described as a game changer for the company, but now the likes of Dan Ives over at Wedbush saying this is a good supply deal, but nothing really to write home about, and that's a bit of a sad indictment for the future of the company. All this, David, catnip for short sellers. They've been piling into the stock as it's ridden a rocky road since it went public earlier this year. We do have a Bloomberg terminal chart which should show you how that short interest has surged as the stock has fallen. It is now the 39th most shorted stock on the NASDAQ. Finally, look at how it compares with its peers in the electric vehicle market. We've got Tesla, we've got Fuel Cell, all of them riding that rally, gaining 200, 300% in the last 6 months. Look at Nikola in the red, David.
In the meantime, not great news for General Motors either, I think it's fair to say. Thank you so much to Emma Chandra for that report on Nikola. Up next, we're going to talk about President Biden's economic team and the implications for black and lower income Americans with Rashed Robinson. He's color of change president. Of course, we know the president-elect really made an issue out of trying to restore economic health to the more challenged parts of our economy. The question is, what can he do with his new team? That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, UK government officials believe a Brexit deal could be done within days. They say the key is to work in good faith on what the UK sees as the last big obstacle, fishing rights. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab called on the EU to recognize that regaining control over British waters is a question of sovereignty for the UK. The third largest oil company in China reportedly will be named to a U.S. blacklist. According to Reuters, CNOOC is among 4 companies to be added to a list of firms controlled or owned by the Chinese military. That could lead to major outflows if U.S. investors divest. Iran is vowing not to, quote, fall into the trap of scrapping any future talks with the Biden administration. The Iranian government posted a statement 2 days after the assassination of a top nuclear scientist. Iran has blamed Israel. Joe Biden has made it clear the United States would rejoin the Obama-era nuclear accord if Tehran also returns to full compliance. President-elect Biden has named longtime Democratic policy staffer Neera Tanden to be his budget chief. If seated to the post, she would be the first person of Indian descent to hold the job. However, Senate Republicans could block the nomination because they see her as too progressive. Meantime, Mr. Bynes also named a senior communications team made up entirely of women, including White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. President-elect Biden comes to office having promised to address the challenges of all Americans, and particularly those of Black and lower-income citizens across the nation. The question now is, how do they do that? We welcome back Rashed Robinson. He is president of Color of Change, a leading online racial justice organization. So, Rashed, always good to have you on with us. One commentator, in looking at some of these appointments, said they really mean they're going to have racial justice throughout their administration. Do you see that in the economic appointments that are being made?
Well, I think there's some really great people that they've appointed, and diversity alone doesn't always mean that we get racial justice. And so part of this is making sure that, yes, we have people with the right level of experiences that are connected to community, that sort of come with a dearth of experience, a level of experience that will help them sort of see the opportunities. But also, we need to also make sure we're pairing that with a progressive worldview. And so it remains to be seen after all the positions get filled out where we actually are. But there is a lot to sort of look forward to. Now the next step will be, how will the Biden team work over the first 100 days to actually deal with COVID relief? And that will be one of our first indicators about how this team will actually work. A lot of what we dealt with coming out of the CARES Act, for instance, was relief for businesses, small businesses, that actually did not get to Black and brown small businesses. A recent poll we just did with the Main Street Alliance shows that up to 46% of Black businesses either have closed or will be closing very soon as a result of the economic instability of this virus, because the sort of relief that went through the big banks actually never got to Black small businesses, because the majority of those businesses were not banking at big institutions. And so it will be sort of not just about the diversity of the faces at the table, but in terms of how will they sort of carry out the policies to ensure that we avoid the sort of challenges of inequality that have plagued the current administration.
Rashed, that's a really great issue. I'm glad you raised it. And my question then is, does that take congressional action to make sure that the money, the stimulus money, gets to the right places? Or are there administrative things that can be done by the executive branch without Congress to really change the rules, as it were, to make sure some of the money gets to the right places?
A lot of it does start at Congress and the negotiation power that the president has. But the president's team will help to shape what the administration will accept or not accept. And there are a lot of things that can be done, but there's also sort of rules and regulations at the executive level that can deal with all the ways in which it has been the wild, wild west for banks. So yes, we may need at the congressional level sort of a new Glass-Steagall that makes sure that commercial banks and public-private banks are not sort of allowed to collude the way that they've sort of been able to. That creates sort of real challenges that led in some ways to the 2008 sort of crash that really wiped away so much Black wealth, right? Black folks disproportionately have a lot of our wealth and savings in home ownership, which has been a pathway to working class and middle class life. And when that sort of fell out, it really decimated a lot of Black communities, Black neighborhoods, and Black people's sort of ability to sort of advance a new future. And so how will these sort of rules at the executive level play themselves out? And then what will the administration be able to push and advance in terms of its relationship with Congress? All of that matters, but who's around the table and how much they are willing to not just sort of see getting back to where we were, but really recognize that we don't want to go back. We only want to go forward. And in order to go forward, we're going to need to have economic policies that just don't talk about lifting all boats, but deal with sort of what is actually keeping some boats down more than others.
So let's talk about that one issue just here in closing, Rashed. That is the disparity in wealth, because we've covered that on this program. It is remarkable. Even before 2008, it was remarkable, the disparity that exists. Give me one specific that we could do, that this administration could do under President-elect Biden that could help remedy that. What could we do to solve that problem?
Well, one quick thing is that we can deal with home ownership and deal with access to home ownership, deal with access to loans. And that's going to actually have to start with both sort of investing in more public banks and making sure that they are sort of fully funded, looking at and dealing with risk in different ways. If we only look at risk through one prism, then what we end up in challenges that are actually more risky for our future, where we have some people that can get ahead and some people that can't get ahead. And then, what we sort of think immediately, given sort of the COVID crisis, is that we will need a recovery package that does deal with more than just one single check, but deals with sort of getting cash in the hands of everyday Americans who need it the most, and can unlock the sort of spending power and spending opportunity of communities that are sort of have been decimated by this crisis.
So, Rashad, I get it about home ownership. It makes good sense because a lot of net worth of people across the country is tied up in homes. Can we really encourage that home ownership without getting us back into that subprime mortgage situation? Because a lot of people think that actually got us in trouble back in 2008.
Well, you get into that problem, right, when you actually send it all through private banks, when you allow corporate banks and private banks, and you don't actually build sort of the sort of public institutions that can actually provide sort of those loans, that can sort of move those resources. Just like with the COVID care relief, when the money was sent from the federal government through sort of big banks that were not incentivized, they took public money. They had already been bailed out once, and then they could use that public money to determine who they wanted to bank with, who they wanted to provide loans to. Who did they provide loans to? People they already had relationships with, which cut out our communities.
Okay, Rashad, as I say, it's always a treat to have you on. It's a really important viewpoint to hear from you. That is Rashed Robinson. He's color of Change President. Coming up, the fate of the Senate ties up on the ballot on 2 runoff elections in Georgia. Political strategist and pollster Frank Luntz is here with his take on where things stand as of today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For the next month, Georgia will be the center of U.S. political attention as 2 Senate runoff elections will determine which party controls the upper house. Political strategist and pollster and founder of Luntz Global has been laser focused on the state of Georgia since election night. And we welcome Frank Luntz now back here for an update. So, Frank, great to have you with us. What is going on in Georgia as you see it?
Well, and I apologize. I think that my video's gone out, but you can still hear me.
I can.
3 things are happening in Georgia. Number 1 is that there's more money going into this race than has ever been spent on a political race in American history. Number 2 is that, quite frankly, so much money is being spent that people are hearing these messages, and they're almost all negative, about 10 to 1 negative, that they're already fed up and they've got another 6-7 weeks to go. And number 3, they realize that they are the center of the universe, of the democratic universe right now. And so Georgia voters get a chance to experience what Iowa and New Hampshire voters get to experience every 4 years. And they know more about the candidates, they know more about the issues. And frankly, they're a little bit fed up, and they've got so much longer to go.
Demographics are always key. You know better than I in an election. But particularly with this election in Georgia, we hear various things about young people, younger voters who haven't voted before. We hear about Asian Americans in Georgia, as well as African Americans. What will determine the voter turnout and the voting?
So number 1 is actually Donald Trump more than anything else. And apparently he is going to Georgia at the end of this week. And if he goes 2 or 3 times, he will have an impact on turnout. I'm going to see if Joe Biden's going to go, because he can have an impact on turnout on that side. So I'm looking at the people who participate in the process, not just the voters themselves. Second is that the key block right now are married, white, women with kids who shifted from the Republican Party to some degree, and some of them voted for Joe Biden for the first time because, frankly, they agreed with Donald Trump but did not like his message. And the Republicans down there have the advantage that they talk about the support for Trump's agenda, but they're not saddled with the negativity that Donald Trump was saddled with. However, Joe Biden and the Democrats have an opportunity unprecedented in Georgia politics because Stacey Abrams, the candidate for governor, has registered more people, more voters than any single individual has ever registered in the state. Those people are first-time voters, and frankly, they don't want to give up until after the runoff on January 5th.
One of the things that we've seen reports of, and I'm curious to see whether you've detected this, is that perhaps all the talk, let's be frank, from President Trump on down about it's a fraud, the election's really rigged, may actually be discouraging some Republican voters from voting. Do you see that in Georgia?
I had seen that in the very first days after the election, but in the work that we've done, and I don't know if you got those slides there, 70% of Democrats in Georgia give this election a 10, which means it is extremely important to them and they're definitely going to vote, compared to 80% of Republicans. We also asked a similar question, which election is more important to you, the presidential election, Senate election? And more Republicans chose the Senate election than Democrats, which means that they are absolutely keyed in on the importance of January 5th. And frankly, with taxes up for grabs, the Green New Deal up for grabs, immigration up for grabs, the filibuster, 2 new states, a change in the Senate, whether or not they're going to try to pack the court, all of these issues are going to be decided by what happens on the 5th of January. I'll let you in on a secret. I have to decide whether or not to sell my house. If I sell it by December 29th, I get the capital gains of the current rate. If I wait and the Democrats take control of the Senate, then they're going to repeal the tax cuts and I will pay a lot more. So David, you and I should stay in touch because I got a personal stake in that Georgia election.
I was going to say, you're a one-man poll, effectively. December 28, we'll call you up and we'll figure out how Georgia's going to come out. So what you described really sounds more pro-Republican, on both the races. Trump's not on the ballot. President Trump is not on the ballot, which helps some. People split their ballot anyway before. If the Democrats, and it would require 2 of them, if they pull it out, how will they do that?
They will do it by raising turnout. Now, there's the most important voter in Georgia. There's 12% who would prefer split tickets, who would prefer to elect one Democrat and one Republican. And that won't give the Democrats the 50-50 vote that they need to take control of the Senate. But that 12% is going to determine if both Republicans win. And right now, Republicans have a 4-point advantage. So, yes, I do think that the advantage goes to the Republicans. However, the Republicans are in disarray. There's internal differences between them. They're arguing with the Secretary of State. There are accusations about the governor and the governor's involvement in the presidential race. That is all leading to chaos and confusion, which you don't want in a race like this. The Democrats are unified. They've got one purpose, one message. They're all following Stacey Abrams, and they like their candidates very much. The Republicans are much more disorganized, but they've got a bigger field to play with. And I'd give the Republicans a 1% advantage if the election were held today.
Talk just at the end here about the money, because we know it's a huge amount of money. Is it evenly split between Democrats and Republicans? Because there are reports, actually, some Democrats on Wall Street are not going in with a lot of money, in part because of your house and the concern about what happens to taxes.
Well, I'd like to think that the Democrats on Wall Street are concerned about my house. I think they'd rather burn it down than do anything with it. You reach a point when you get to saturation, when there's simply nothing that the money can buy. They have all the voter contacts they need. They've got all the advertising they need. They got all the social media they need. And so I'm telling now candidates from both parties or donors in both parties, within the next week, unless you're donating right now, your money, there's nothing it can be spent on. I mean, that's how important this election is. They're going to spend millions in this election because it's going to impact many, many billions of dollars.
Frank, it's always great to have you with us. That is Pollster Frank Luntz, and I'm delighted to say we're going to have more with Frank in our second hour on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, the pandemic north of the border. Global affairs analyst Michael Barcer is here with a report on what looks to be a growing crisis in Canada. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's not the first time the United States is so focused on its own problems that it overlooks what's going on to the north of us. And so, as we report every day on the pandemic and lockdowns and vaccine development in the United States, we tend not to hear much about the situation in Canada. So we welcome today Global Affairs analyst Michael Barcer for a report on COVID-19 in Canada. Michael, it's always great to have you on with us. Give us a sense of the state of the COVID-19 up in Canada right now.
Sure. Good to be back on with you, David. Well, look, a few months ago, Canada was doing nothing less than crushing the curve. And I mean it. We had cases down to triple digits. Now we're looking at about an average of 5,000 cases a week. Now, that's not much compared to 160,000 in the U.S., but Canada was doing really well. We went into long lockdowns. We listened to our government. We got a lot of support so we could stay at home. But that now all seems to be evaporating. And the big kind of breaking news, David, from last week was that Canadians were told for the very first time that the majority of us, that's 50% plus, may not be vaccinated until the end of 2021, December 2021. Now, that's months after people in other G7 countries like the U.S., Germany, United Kingdom. And of course, a big reason for that is you and other G7 countries have your own domestic vaccine production. So vaccines will be distributed there first. But Canada, David, used to have that capacity, but under successive governments, it wasn't put back in. So we're really on a weak footing right now. And by the way, I was just on the WHO press conference in Geneva, and I put it to them, is there any excuse for countries not being ready for a coming pandemic in terms of vaccine production, PPE vaccination? And they said, no, it's not like nature wasn't telling us not to get ready.
Well, Justin Trudeau, your prime minister, is not alone in this. A lot of political damage is being done to leaders around the world. But what's the reaction right now? Are they blaming the prime minister?
Yeah, the prime minister, some people call him the Teflon prime minister. He survived many scandals. You may remember SNC-Lavalin, the wheat charity scandal, trips with Aga Khan. Those are all kind of floated into the background. But I think because right now Canadians, like in many countries, are at the end of their tether, the economy is really having a tough time surviving under COVID, that we thought the light at the end of the tunnel would come even as soon as the end of this year, beginning of next year. And I think, personally, this is going to be very damaging potentially to the Prime Minister when that split screen happens of Americans getting vaccinated, perhaps in the next few weeks, in the United Kingdom, Germany, possibly even Mexico, India, whereas Canadians are sitting at home under lockdowns, waiting for that vaccine to come. Now, I should say we are getting about 6 million doses, probably in January, but that will be consumed very quickly by the most vulnerable and frontline healthcare workers.
So, Michael, as you know, we've got a new president coming into office January 20. Joe Biden will be coming in. As Canada looks south to this transition here, what do you hope or want out of a President Biden?
Sure. Well, when the results were announced, I think you could hear the ground shaking in Canada from everyone hopping up and down. It was very well received because, look, President Trump was very insulting to our prime minister, and Canadians don't like that coming from a U.S. president. Trump called him very dishonest and weak, and Mr. Kudlow, I believe, said, Trudeau, there's a place in hell for anyone like Trudeau insulting Trump. But the other thing that was happening, White House under Trump oversaw surprise duty applications on multiple trade commodities, from steel to aluminum, squeezed Ottawa really hard on that free trade negotiation. And also, we had that partial untangling of our highly integrated supply chain between Canada and the U.S. So what we're looking for really is a couple of things, restore a sense of civility to the bilateral relationship. We're looking forward to having the U.S. back on the world stage, defending a rules-based international order, getting back into those accords like the Paris Accord, because climate change is something we both share a lot of. We got all of that smoke up here, too, from those forest fires in Washington, Oregon, and California. And then but we're not, sorry, David, there's one more thing, the Keystone XL pipeline. That is a worrying cloud that Biden opposes expansion of Keystone XL. And Albertans in our oil-producing province see that as key to economic recovery. So that may not happen. But then the other thing is we're not naive. We know that the election wasn't a robust repudiation of Trumpian sensibilities. So we're not expecting a complete reset back to the Obama years.
Just a little civility. But as a practical matter, that pipeline could really be a sticking point.
Yeah, the Alberta economy was really hurting beforehand because of the drop in oil prices. And now because of COVID, cities like Calgary, which is kind of our Houston, is really, really suffering. And the federal government is spending a lot to prop up the provinces, but with Alberta in such bad shape and with, by the way, record high COVID numbers, very difficult to bail them out.
Michael, always a treat to get to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Global Affairs Analyst Michael Barcer. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to bioethicist Art Kaplan of NYU Langone about how we're going to prioritize who gets the vaccine once it's available here in the United States. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.